So when we encounter people today who to whom this whole idea just seems offensive or incomprehensible or foolish or whatever, we shouldn't be surprised, because that's exactly the same response it got in the world in the first century. So we have the element of embarrassment coming up repeatedly in the Passion narrative. So you have multiple accounts of cowardice on the part of the male followers of Christ, right? You have just that whole scandal of crucifixion. That's just an embarrassing story. It's unlikely that it would have just been made up. You have, in contrast to the cowardice of the men, you have a very positive portrayal of the women's role in the whole Passion narrative. Their place at the cross, their place at the tomb, and that sort of thing. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. This is our last lesson on the life and death of Christ, and then next week we will start talking about the resurrection. And we have 3 lessons on the resurrection. So we are talking today about the crucifixion, issues about the crucifixion and death of Christ. Some resources there. Again, the Baker Encyclopedia is a tremendous source. John Lennox, in his book Gunning for God, has a section on the crucifixion of Christ. Then there's this little book written by this really quite well-known German scholar, historian of the Second Temple Jerusalem, Second Temple Judaism era, and early Christianity, a guy by the name of Martin Hengel, and he's written just a superb little book on crucifixion, and it's just full of just really some tremendous stuff, some tremendous information in there on crucifixion. Nabil Qureshi, who of course has by now passed away, has a lecture that he gave at Biola on Jesus in Islam. How does Islam view Jesus? And so of course he talks about the Islamic view regarding Jesus and the crucifixion, which we'll talk about some today. And then William Lane Craig has a fairly recent book, Atonement and the Death of Christ, which is a exegetical, historical, and philosophical examination of the whole issue of what we might call penal substitution or vicarious atonement. So it's just a tremendous study, and he answers many of the questions that we're talking about today. So we might ask ourselves, well, why do we have to talk about the crucifixion in an apologetics class? I mean, doesn't everybody, know about the crucifixion and that sort of thing? And actually there are several reasons. Of course, one of the first reasons is that the crucifixion is, along with the resurrection, of course, really the central issue in the Christian faith. Okay, so it's just something that we cannot compromise on at all, or we've lost the Christian faith. It is, Jesus himself said, this is the reason why I came. This is the reason for Jesus. And of course, according to Christian doctrine, it's the only basis by which human beings can be reconciled to God. So it is absolutely crucial. And then the crucifixion along with the resurrection, of course. But the crucifixion is one aspect of Christianity that really sets it apart from all other religious beliefs and all other religious systems. No other religious system has anything like the crucifixion. So Justin Martyr, who was writing about 100 years after the life of Christ, said, "It is the crucifixion that distinguishes the new message from the mythologies of all other people." So even at that early stage, it was very clear that for Christianity, the crucifixion really is what set it apart. Can you see okay? Okay. And then Martin Hengel, who I just mentioned, says in his book, he says, "Crucifixion distinguishes the new message from the old myth." So this really is an important thing for us to make sure that people have clear in their understanding. And unfortunately, there is a great deal of misunderstanding about the crucifixion. A lot of it is propagated by the new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins and that sort of thing. And the issue with them is they actually consider this whole Christian doctrine of Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus' death on the cross for man's sin, to be what they call a morally repellent doctrine. They just consider it to be completely repellent. And they do that for a couple reasons. One is they believe that the idea that God would demand such a brutal punishment or violent death on the part of His Son for others, they just consider that to be just a horrible idea. And oftentimes you'll hear them refer to it. In fact, I believe I've even seen people in progressive Christianity, so-called progressive Christianity, refer to it as cosmic child abuse. Okay, so this is the idea that some people have. And then there is the point that they object to, the idea that one person could pay for the crimes or the offenses or the sins of another person. To them, that just seems unjust. How could it be that one person incurs the guilt, incurs the blame, but then doesn't have to bear the penalty for it? And they just, to that just seems incredibly unjust. And then there are people who just outright deny either the crucifixion or Jesus' death by crucifixion. And so one theory that's been out there for quite a while is what's called the swoon theory. And primarily the swoon theory came up as a way of trying to discount the resurrection claim. So it's really part of it, and we'll talk about it again when we get into our resurrection lessons here in the next couple weeks. But so the swoon theory, of course, is the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, right? And then, of course, there are Muslims who deny that Jesus died on the cross at all. Okay, so for Muslims, they're really kind of the official Muslim doctrine is that Jesus didn't die, that He ascended into heaven, and that, of course, they reject the crucifixion and the resurrection. But given all of that, it is still nevertheless true that the church has preached the cross, in spite of the ideas that people have about the crucifixion, that the church has preached the cross from the very beginning. And from the very beginning, it's been considered by non-believers to be a foolish message. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he says, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block." The word there is skandalon. The Greek word is skandalon. "And to the Gentiles foolishness." The Greek word there is moria, from which we get moronic or moron. "But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God." So right out of the gate, right off the bat, to the Jews who heard the message of the preaching of the cross, it was scandalous. This idea that their Messiah, that their God would undergo this horrific, shameful, disgusting death was just absolutely scandalous to them. And to the Gentiles, it was just foolishness. It was just folly. Okay? And the reasons for that are that in the Greco-Roman world and in the Jewish world, it would just be absolutely ludicrous for anybody who was wanting to start a new religion, so to speak. If you're trying to start a new religion, it would just be ridiculous to have as part of the central idea of your religion that your God was crucified, that your God died, and particularly the idea that he was crucified. But the startling thing is that's what the church preached, okay? And so just the fact that the church preached the crucifixion, preached the death of Christ by crucifixion, the fact that the church did that is in fact one of the evidences we have that it actually happened, because it's just incomprehensible. It was certainly in the first century, it would have been incomprehensible for anybody to do that if they were starting a new religion unless it actually happened. So it turns out that the church's preaching of the crucifixion is one of the strongest evidences for it actually happening. So we have, of course, then this just absolute incredulity in the world among the non-Christians. It was just absolutely unthinkable. But that's true today as well, okay? So when we encounter people today who to whom this whole idea just seems offensive or incomprehensible or foolish or whatever, we shouldn't be surprised, because that's exactly the same response it got in the world in the first century. And in fact, the only reason we don't get as strong a reaction against the idea of crucifixion as they did in the first century is because people are so familiar with it today, and Christianity's been around so long, people are used to it, and so you don't get quite as much backlash to it as they got in the first century. But we shouldn't underestimate the reaction of people in the first century because of what is referred to as the scandal of the cross, all right? So why was this idea of crucifixion of Christ so scandalous? And one of the reasons is because crucifixion was just absolutely the most horrific, horrible, painful, torturous, and disgusting and shameful way that the Romans could think of to put somebody to death. Now, the Romans didn't invent crucifixion. Actually, there's records of it back in Persia centuries before, but the Romans managed to refine it, if you want to call it that. They managed to refine it to a point of just exquisite torture. So the Seneca was a Roman author in the first century, around the time of Nero, and he made several comments about crucifixion. He called it the most cruel and disgusting punishment. He called it the worst extremes of torture, and he referred to the terror of the cross. So in the Roman world there was just this, according to Seneca, there was just this terror of the idea of somebody being crucified or one being crucified. And in fact, the Latin word for cross is the word crux. Of course, we're familiar with the word crux, we use it today. But one of the interesting things about the word crux is it is really the root word to our word excruciating. So it just gives us some idea of just the whole idea of what crucifixion entailed. And of course, you know, for any of you who've watched The Passion of Christ, you know, you just get you get a little bit of a picture of what it was like. And then there was attached to crucifixion not just the brutality of it, but just the contemptuous nature of it. It was called the servile supplicium. Okay, so this means the slave's punishment. So primarily, crucifixion was a kind of death that was reserved for the lowest classes of people, particularly slaves, in the Roman Empire. And you'll remember, if you're reading the book of Acts, towards the end of the book of Acts, Paul is coming to Rome, and you remember him. It says he goes down the Appian Way. He comes into Rome via the Appian Way. And it turns out that about less than 100 years before Paul went into Rome along the Appian Way, there had been in the Roman Empire, there had been a major slave rebellion led by Spartacus. And he had led this major slave rebellion. And in 71 BC, the Romans managed finally to suppress that rebellion. And so they took these rebellious slaves, many of these rebellious slaves, and they crucified them en masse along the Appian Way. 6,000 slaves, all crucified simultaneously for 110 miles along the Appian Way. So it was so horrific that you could actually smell the rotting corpses for many miles on either side of the Appian Way. This is how Rome responds to slave rebellions. And so this idea of crucifixion is closely associated with slaves and slave rebellion and that sort of thing. And the interesting thing is that when the church then begins to preach, they don't shy away from that image of crucifixion, right? So Paul, in that great Christological hymn there in Philippians chapter 2, where he is exalting Christ in that beautiful hymn there in Philippians chapter 2, doesn't shy away at all from this image, this picture of crucifixion. He refers to Jesus as the one who took on the form of a slave and who humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So the church, instead of shying away from this picture of crucifixion as being the slave's punishment, they embrace that, and that's part of the glory of Christ that Paul portrays for us there in Philippians chapter 2. So when we encounter people today who react to the crucifixion like Dawkins or whatever and just regard it with such contempt, of course, in some ways that's offensive to us, but in other ways it should just remind us of what the early church faced when they began to preach the gospel. And it should help us put into some perspective the significance of the growth in the early church in the first century, given this huge obstacle that they had to overcome in the minds of people. So the question then, of course, is, did Jesus really die by crucifixion? And I mentioned the swoon theory a few minutes ago. You're probably familiar with it. But basically the idea is that Jesus just swooned, or he fainted on the cross, or perhaps went into maybe a somewhat of a coma. And then he was removed from the cross and he was put in the coolness and the darkness and the supposed humidity of the tomb. Of course, no tombs were humid in Palestine at the time, but that's the theory. So he's put in this dark, very quiet, secluded place, and over a period of hours he then finally begins to recover and he regains consciousness. And then in this emaciated, tortured, beat up body, he manages to push the stone away from the tomb and manage to escape past the soldiers, find his disciples in seclusion in Jerusalem, and then presents himself as the glorious Lord who has conquered death. Okay, so this is the theory. In some versions of the theory, the idea is that the disciples took him down from the cross, carried him into a secluded place, and then nursed him back to health, and then proclaimed him as the risen. So this whole idea, this whole swoon theory, just has insurmountable difficulties. One of it, of course, is what we know from medical research about crucifixion, is that it's just virtually impossible to survive, okay? Even under normal circumstances. And in fact, there is only in ancient history, in Roman history, there is only one record of anybody surviving crucifixion. And it's a story that Josephus, the Jewish historian who was in cahoots, was very closely tied to the Romans, excuse me. He tells the story of two of his friends that he discovered. He learned that they had been arrested by the Romans and they were in the process of being crucified, and he went to the Roman authorities and pleaded for their lives, and he was granted their lives, and so he arranged to have them removed from the cross before they had died, So it wasn't that they endured a full crucifixion and survived, but they were removed from the cross, and then they were given, of course, what available medical treatment there was. One of them subsequently died, but one of them did manage to survive. So in one sense you could say, well, yes, it's possible to survive. That's the only record we have, and of course it was not a case of a full crucifixion. And then there's just the problem that the swoon theory cannot account for the belief of the early Christians. So for example, to think that somehow Jesus appeared and after being beaten and tortured and emaciated the way he was and presented himself alive, that implies, of course, deception on the part of the disciples and deception on the part of Jesus, particularly if you embrace that second part of that second alternative theory, that the disciples actually brought him back, gave him medical treatment and brought him back to health. Then Jesus himself is part of a conspiracy to deceive, which we know runs completely counter to everything we know about Jesus otherwise, right? So it just doesn't fit his character. And then it doesn't account for all the other things, and we'll see this when we get into our resurrection model. It doesn't account for all the other things we know from evidences for the resurrection. So it doesn't account for example, the testimony of the women and the experience of the women. It doesn't account for the conversion of Paul. It doesn't account for the birth of the early church. So the swoon theory just doesn't carry any weight. And there are no historians, no reputable historians today, certainly, that embrace the swoon theory. Then you have the Islamic denial of Jesus' death by crucifixion. Okay, and as I mentioned, typically most Muslims don't believe that Jesus died at all. They believe he was a great prophet of God, and that he ascended directly into heaven. Okay. And a key verse that they'll point to in the Quran is Surah 4:157, where it says, "And they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but another was made to resemble him to them. They did not kill him for certain." And there are two primary ways that Muslims view that verse. One is that God caused someone else to look like Jesus, so that the Roman authorities and the Jews grabbed this person and crucified this person, and he died, but it wasn't Jesus. It was somebody God had made to look like Jesus. A second alternative is that it was Jesus on the cross, and it looked like he died, but he didn't really die. Okay, so that's basically just another version of the swoon theory. And it should be helpful when you're talking to Muslims to understand why do they believe this, okay, in addition to, of course, what the Quran says. But one reason they deny his death by crucifixion is because to them, Jesus was a great prophet, as great as Muhammad, okay? So Jesus was this great prophet. And it's just inconceivable to them that God would allow one of his great prophets to suffer and die in such a gruesome and horrible and shameful way. To them, it just doesn't fit with their idea of what God would do with one of his prophets. But really at the core of it is that for Muslims, you don't need atonement, okay? Because man is not basically sinful. Man isn't basically evil. So the problem isn't a sin nature that we have. The problem is that we just do bad things. And so the way to salvation for the Muslim, of course, is not through atonement, but it's through just simply doing good works. And if you are a good enough Muslim, if you do good enough works, if you confess Allah to be God and Muhammad to be his prophet, you're a good Muslim, and you will merit salvation. And so to them, the whole idea of atonement is just foreign to their thinking. So there would be no reason to believe that Jesus actually needed to die on the cross. But when we look at the actual history regarding the death of Christ, we learn important things. For example, Jesus' death by crucifixion is reported by multiple sources. It's reported by multiple Christian sources, but it's also reported by even multiple pagan sources refer to the death of Christ. by crucifixion under the hands of Pontius Pilate. So we have multiple sources, and some of those sources actually come quite early. So here in a couple of weeks we'll look at one source that is actually that refers to the death of Christ that may actually be dated as close as 6 months after the crucifixion. So we have very, very early sources and multiple sources in history referring to the death of Christ. And then there's this thing that we've talked about in our history module. We talk about criteria of authenticity or historical authenticity markers, okay? And when we think about the evidence that we have for the crucifixion, the story that we have of the crucifixion, we find several of these authenticity markers, and one of them is plausibility. And what we mean by that is that there are just a number of things in the Passion narrative, in the narrative about Jesus' crucifixion, that fit with what we know from other sources about the times, okay? So the characters that are involved, Herod and Pilate, these are personalities that we see testified to in other places in history. Geographical descriptions of things that happened in the Passion narrative. And just the way crucifixion is described and the reaction of people and that sort of thing, all fits. It's all very plausible in that it fits very closely with what we know about that time and that era. And then the second thing, and we'll come back to this again, the second thing is the element of embarrassment that we've talked about. So when we find in the Gospels, when we find stories that are embarrassing to the disciples, or would be embarrassing to the disciples, it's unlikely that they would have just been made up, right? So we have the element of embarrassment coming up repeatedly in the Passion narrative. So you have multiple accounts of cowardice on the part of the male followers of Christ, right? You have just that whole scandal of crucifixion. That's just an embarrassing story. It's unlikely that it would have just been made up. You have, in contrast to the cowardice of the men, you have a very positive portrayal of the women's role in the whole Passion narrative. Their place at the cross, their place at the tomb, and that sort of thing. These are all things that would have been embarrassing to the church in those early decades, and it's just unlikely that somebody would have just fabricated those things. And then, as I've mentioned, there are a number of early multiple sources. That's one of the criteria of authenticity. And then there's the element of dissimilarity. And what we mean by that in this case is that because of the way the Greco-Roman and Jewish worlds thought about crucifixion, it's just inconceivable that anybody would have fabricated this story. So it doesn't fit with the way people thought at the time. So it's very unlikely that somebody would have just simply made up this story. And then there is what we just talked about a few minutes ago, that what we know from the history of crucifixion, from historical records, and what we know from medical research is just the virtual impossibility of surviving a full crucifixion. So D.F. Strauss, who was a 19th century theologian, actually a liberal theologian, he says, how a flagellated, half-dead victim of the hideous torture of crucifixion could impress others as triumphant over death is hard to envisage. And then there's the element that David was just mentioning, just the point that Roman soldiers knew how to kill people, and they knew when people were dead. And then, of course, as David mentioned, just to make sure, they actually pierced his side with a sword to make sure that Jesus was dead. So the chance that the Romans failed in killing Jesus is a pretty slim possibility. And then again, we just keep coming back to this scandalous nature of the crucifixion. Just makes it really unlikely that somebody would have made that up. And then there's the question of how do you account for the birth of Christianity without the crucifixion? So if you don't have the crucifixion and the resurrection which then follows it, how do you account for in the 4th and 5th decades of the of the first century. There's just a sudden explosive birth of Christianity, which we see from history. And then there's that question about if Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, what happened to him? And where is the record? So if you have this guy who's just tremendously influential and tremendously well known in Palestine at that time, how does he just kind of fade off the scene with no record? All right. So we have no other record, no other account in antiquity. We have no other account from that time period of the fate of Jesus other than the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. That's the only account we have. So as it turns out, today there is a fairly strong historical consensus on the death of Christ. So Michael Licona, and we'll talk more about him in coming lessons because he's done some tremendous work on the resurrection, but he classifies the death of Jesus in what he calls the historical bedrock. And what Licona means by historical bedrock are things in history which are very strongly evidenced. We have very strong evidence in history for them, and in addition to that, the belief, the conviction of virtually all recognized scholars in the field, historical scholars in the field, accept it to be true. Okay? So, in other words, there may be many other things that are true, that have a lot of evidence from history, but may not enjoy the kind of consensus that Licona insists needs to be there to call it historical bedrock. So, what I'm saying is he's not saying that historical bedrock are the only things that happen that we can believe, but what he's saying is when we're talking about these things, we have such a strong consensus among historians that it's just virtually certain that this happened. And he classifies the death of Christ in that category of historical bedrock, of which there is virtual absolute certainty. And then there's John McIntyre, who was a Scottish theologian in the last century, and he said, even those scholars and critics who have been moved to depart from almost everything else within the historical content of Christ's presence on earth have found it impossible to think away the factuality of the death of Christ. And then there's this atheist historian, Gerd Ludemann. He says Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. So there is just tremendous consensus among historians on this particular aspect of the life of Christ. So we have every reason to have confidence that in fact it did happen. But then the question comes up, well, is it morally repellent? Is the Christian interpretation of Christ's crucifixion, is it morally repellent? So there's kind of two questions here that I think I already mentioned to you. One is, why couldn't God just forgive? Okay, so God is God, and He's infinite, and He's powerful, and He's all these things. So instead of requiring this bloody, horrible, brutal sacrifice of His own Son, why couldn't God just forgive us? Okay, so that's one way that people sometimes think about it. And then the other is this idea of vicarious atonement or penal substitution, which is, how can one person atone for the guilt of another? How could that be just? That I do something that's terribly wrong, and I don't have to pay the penalty. If somebody else pays, how is that just, right? How does that meet the requirements of justice? Now, when these issues are raised by skeptics, the new atheists, and even people you may meet at work or whatever, when these are raised, there are several things they're really ignoring that are crucial in our Christian faith, but crucial to them as well. And one of them is just the problem of sin. So oftentimes people just think of sin as just kind of a mistake people make, right? They just made a mistake. But sin is not just simply a mistake. Sin is a profound and pervasive rebellion against a holy and loving God, right? So it's profound in the sense that our sin is not just some little glitch. It's not like bumping into somebody at Walmart and saying, excuse me, right? It is an actual profound rebellion, and it's pervasive in the sense that it pervades our entire being. We are by nature in outright rebellion against God. And if you don't recognize that, if you don't see that, then of course this whole idea of vicarious atonement gets a little strange. But when you recognize the significance of the sin, then it becomes more understandable. So what's happening then is people are trivializing sin. They're making sin less significant than what it is. But the problem is, when you trivialize sin, you trivialize people. When you trivialize sin, you're saying you don't matter. If I trivialize my sin, what I'm saying is I don't matter. The things I do don't matter to God. He can just blow them off because they don't really matter. They are insignificant. And if my actions are insignificant, then I am insignificant. And if my sin, if my wrongdoings are insignificant, then on the flip side, everything I do good or heroic is also insignificant. If my evil deeds are insignificant to God, why should I believe that He cares at all if I do anything good? Okay, and then all sin is trivialized. Okay, so when we think, well, you know, God should just kind of blow off my sin if I yell at my wife, or if I neglect my children, or I, betray my wife and get into an adult. God should just blow that off, but He shouldn't blow off Hitler. He shouldn't blow off the slave traders. He shouldn't blow off ISIS. He should do something about those, but He shouldn't do anything about my sin because my sin is so insignificant. And then, of course, there is the problem of justice. We all intuitively we have within us a sense of the need and the rightness of justice, that there needs to be justice for things. Okay, so I might be quick to dismiss the need for justice when somebody else is offended or somebody else is hurt. So when my neighbor suffers some injustice, I might say, well, just forgive them, But if somebody comes into my home and steals my property, suddenly I want justice, right? So it's just intuitively built within all people, this need for justice. And what the denial of Christ's death by crucifixion for our sins does is it takes away that justice that we so desperately call for. And then the other thing is that justice needs to be proportional to the offense. So if someone breaks into my house and kills my children, and then they're arrested and they're taken to court, and the judge fines them $100, that's not justice. That doesn't satisfy. So, if he drives across my lawn and tears up my grass, then if the judge fines him $100 for that, well, that might be okay, right? But it's not okay if he killed my children. So justice has to be commensurate with whatever the offense was. So then when we think about how can vicarious atonement be justified, I think there are several stipulations. One is it needs to rectify the conduct of the offender. So if someone commits an offense and an atonement is made, the atonement has to be such, particularly vicarious atonement, has to be such that that person no longer acts that way. No, that person no longer does that. If he goes on without any consideration of the wrong that he's done in the past, or the cost that somebody had to pay for that wrong that he did in the past, if he just goes on living that same way, then that atonement has not been just. It really hasn't. It hasn't been righteous, right? And then it has to satisfy the requirement of justice, right? So it has to meet those stipulations that we just talked about. It has to properly value the degree of the offense given. So a $100 fine for somebody who murders somebody, it's not valuing the degree of the offense. Secondly, it has to satisfy the offended person's sense of what would be righteous judgment. So the question, when it comes to Christ's atonement for our sins, the question is not, does it satisfy my sense of what's right? The question, because God is the one who's offended, the question is, does it satisfy God's sense of what is right? All right? So these are elements that are necessary to justify vicarious atonement. And then there are three kind of primary issues to think about when it comes to vicarious atonement, things that need to be addressed. And one is the issue of necessity. And that is that we as human beings, given the nature of our offense, given the true seriousness of sin, we are not capable of making atonement. We can't make atonement for our sin. Okay, if I commit a crime, if I destroy my neighbor's, if I run into my neighbor's car and smash his car, then then I can go to my insurance company and have them pay for it, and restitution and atonement can be made. But when it comes to sin against God, that's impossible, because God is infinite and He's infinitely holy, and so any sin that I do is its magnitude of significance is just so great. There's just no way that I can atone for my sin. So what that means is, if vicarious atonement is not possible, so if I can't atone for my sin, if somebody else can't vicariously atone for my sin, then I'm without hope. There's no way I can be reconciled to God. Right? And then there's the issue of justice, what we've just been talking about. So to be just, vicarious atonement needs to meet several conditions. And if it doesn't meet those conditions, then the atonement would not be just, and it wouldn't serve the purposes of righteousness and justice. And there are several things that come into play here. One is the offender has to own his wrongdoing. He has to say, okay, I did it. I'm really the one who's guilty. So if somebody offers atonement for something I refuse to admit I did, then that would not be just. That would not be righteous. So the first thing would be, I'd have to own it. I'd have to say, yes, I did it. The second thing is, I would have to have a change of mind about that, right? I'd have to say, okay, I did it, and it was wrong, and I shouldn't have done it, and I don't want to do that in the future. That's what we call repentance, right? A change of mind. And then the third thing is, the offender needs to acknowledge the offer. So if someone is offering to make atonement for my sin, if I need to first own my sin, I need to acknowledge that what I did was wrong, but I also need to acknowledge this person is making atonement. Okay? It's not just enough to know that and then just kind of blissfully go on my way and ignore what someone is doing to make the payment for what I have done. I have to acknowledge that offer of provision. And then the third question about vicarious atonement is, how is it accomplished? And again, there are several things that come into play here. Some on the part of the one making atonement, and then some on the part of the person who is having his sins atoned for. So the first thing is, the person making atonement has to be sufficiently righteous that they are qualified to make the atonement. All right? But because our sin is against God, and because sin against God is so profound and so great in its significance, if the person who's going to make atonement for my sin has themselves sinned, they're going to be so busy paying for their own sin throughout eternity that they're not going to have any resource left to pay for my sin. So it would be necessary then for whoever is atoning for my sin to themselves be perfect so that they have the resources to pay for my sin. Secondly, that person would have to be just incomprehensibly great, right? So that they could satisfy the scope of my offense, but not only my offense, but of all the offenses of all people. So the person would have to be perfect, and they would have to be incomprehensibly great. And then they would have to provide a sufficient atonement in order to adequately compensate for all of the offense, right? So in order for there to be a vicarious atonement for my sin, I need a perfect sacrifice. I need a perfect atoner, who is Jesus. I need a one who is atoning, who is immeasurably great, who is Jesus, God Himself. And then I need the sacrifice to be commensurate with the offense that I have given and that all of us have given. Okay? That is why the crucifixion is so important. It has to have been a horrible death in order to satisfy the offense that has been given. That's what's necessary on the part of the atoner. On the part of the wrongdoer, as we've mentioned, he has to acknowledge his sin, he has to own his sin, he has to confess his sin, he has to have a change of mind, he has to repent, he has to say, okay, I was wrong, and I'm not going to live that way, I don't want to live that way anymore, and have an intent to change. And then he has to receive the atonement gratefully and humbly. If a person does not receive the atonement humbly, what that implies is a presumption of merit, right? And so if I don't receive the atonement humbly and gratefully, then what I'm saying is, I'm so good, you owe me this, right? It's a presumption that that atonement is going to be made for me, and that, of course, would show that I'm not truly repentant. All right? So in order to benefit from the atonement, and in order for the vicarious atonement to be just, I have to humbly receive it. So we have substantial answers to the people who have questions about this question of the atonement. And I think of Isaac Watts' hymn. He says, "When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to His blood. See, from His head, His hands, His feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown?" Okay? So that brings us then to our next lesson, which is the resurrection. And there are several issues that we need to address regarding the resurrection. And the first thing is, we need to understand, what does the New Testament mean when it talks about resurrection? And there's a great deal of confusion on that. So next week we're going to explore, how did the first century world, how did the Greco-Roman world, how did the Jews view resurrection, and what did the New Testament mean when it discusses and talks about the resurrection of Jesus? And then the next question, of course, is, did it happen? Okay? And that's what we'll talk about in our second week, is what are the evidences for the resurrection? And then our final lesson, the third week on a resurrection, we will deal with the question of what really happened on Easter Sunday morning. And if you read the four Gospels, you know they're kind of all over the place. And there are a lot of questions about what really happened, and are there conflicts, and what do those conflicts mean in the various narratives and that sort of thing. So we're going to look at the question of what really happened on that first Easter Sunday morning, and then we're going to look at, briefly, we're going to get into theology, and we're going to just talk about what does it mean. And that'll be the end of our apologetic year. So that's where we're headed. So see you all next week.